But first this week, we've shone a big light in The Australian on how the Chinese government has been recruiting Australian scientists for a secretive research program that typically offers lucrative salaries and perks, but requires the academic's invention to be patented in China and even obliges them to abide by Chinese law. The revelations have included that an Australian scientist who's been feted at a university in China designated high risk for its level of defence research is also a senior academic at UTS in Sydney. At that same university, UTS, its vice president of global partnerships used to work in the Chinese consulate, and before that, in China's Ministry for Foreign Affairs. There's also a professor at Curtin University in WA who spent most of this year in China working at a university also designated high risk for the level of research that it conducts. And there's several other Australian academics whose research areas include missile control and drone formation. And drone formation goes to the very future of aerial warfare. And these academics have worked at Chinese universities that also focus on defence research. One of these academics even admitted to being the international head of a base at that university for a while before ANU in Canberra advised him that it was best not to continue in that role. Now, this has been a significant issue this week. Dan Tehan, who's the Education Minister, told Andrew Bolt that there were now investigations underway into some of the cases that we raised at The Australian and that some of them were operational matters.
What also is happening, Andrew, is all these cases are being investigated. Now, obviously, there are some things which are obviously operational matters which I can't go into tonight, but these are exactly the reasons why we have our intelligence agencies working so closely with our universities. Now, that research will also benefit our nation by providing better stability into our grid. Now, what has happened with regards to those patents, obviously if there has been illegal activity where those patents have been recognised against the will of those researchers or scientists, then that will be investigated, and obviously measures will be put in place to, as best we can, to try and prevent that occurring again. And that is why it's so important that we've got guidelines in place, that we've got a counter foreign interference coordinator who can look at all these issues and make sure we're dealing with them as a nation. And as I've said, the guidelines that we've put in place are regarded as best practice, and other governments have been asked to put in place what we've done.
And that was a terrific interview by Andrew Bolt, and you should have a look at it if you haven't seen it already. Look it up online. But it shouldn't take journalists to expose these issues. There should already be oversight of these problems by the federal government or its agencies. The problem is, right now, there is none at all. It's falling through the cracks. It's not strictly in ASIO's remit, and it's not in the remit of the AFP. The system appears to be completely broken. And as a result, there is a risk universities are compromising our national security.
The Australian university sector has failed. Now, as a government, we've been doing a lot over the last 2 or 3 years, Dan Tehan particularly with the University Foreign Interference Task Force. But the universities have failed here, and that's why I and other colleagues have called for parliamentary scrutiny of this sector.
But you're right, Andrew, these are disturbing allegations, and particularly the absence of knowledge on the part of the universities is very alarming. That their academics may have been participating in these programs without the knowledge of the universities, let alone the public, is profoundly disturbing. And that's why Andrew Hastie and I, in Sharri Markson's report on Monday, called for a wide-ranging parliamentary inquiry into foreign interference in Australian universities. And today, in a follow-up story, a number of other parliamentary colleagues have joined us in that call, including Kimberly Kitching and Anthony Byrne, too many to list. And I think that really is necessary to shine a light on these practices which are not transparent and which I think will alarm many Australians. And
James Patterson and Andrew Hastie were just two of those who were calling for an parliamentary inquiry into foreign interference in our university sector this week. But it's not just on Sky where this has been an issue. Labor Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers told ABC Radio that the 1,000 Talents Plan has been a concern for some time.
Very concerning report, clearly. I mean, the program itself that's referred to there is not I think it's called the 1,000 Talents program. That's not a new program, and certainly there have been concerns raised in this area in general about protecting the reputation of our universities, but also turning the ideas that we have here into jobs here. Turning our ideas into jobs is a really crucial part of how we're going to recover from this crisis.
Now, Bob Katter is particularly passionate about this issue, and he's been working with Drew Pavlou, who's actually watching the show right now. They've been working together to set up an inquiry into foreign interference. Bob Katter's travelled all the way to Parliament House in Canberra to tomorrow lodge a motion in Parliament. He's got the support, he says, of Barnaby Joyce and also Craig Kelly to move this motion. Unfortunately for Bob Katter, when he gets back to Queensland, he's going to have to quarantine for a full 2 weeks, but such is his commitment to this that he's travelling to Canberra just to move this motion. We'll see where all of this goes tomorrow. But joining me now to discuss this issue and more is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Executive Director, Peter Jennings. Peter, what do you think about the notion that universities, through recruitment programs like the 1,000 Talents Plan, but there are several others as well, or there's up to 200 others, what do you think about the concept that they're potentially compromising our national security?
Sharri, I think there's a serious concern that this could compromise national security because the depth of research agreements that exists with China is so substantial now. I count around 1,700 agreements. They can cover student placements as well as research, but frankly, no one really knows what the content of these agreements covers. In some cases, 1,000 Talent scholars have told the Australian universities they're working with Chinese institutions. In other cases, they appear to be hiding these things. What's needed, Sharri, is we've got to shine a light on this. I think the more of this which is put into the public realm, the better for our Australian universities, the better for national security. If Parliament can play a role in that, I would completely support that idea of a parliamentary inquiry.
The problem is, of course, that programs like this, and specifically the 1,000 Talents Plan, has gone underground since the FBI started really proactively investigating it in 2018. So now, in many contracts, it states that the academic is not allowed to disclose they're a participant of the 1,000 Talents Plan without permission. And if you read some of the contracts, it's quite extraordinary. The academics are, and this is legally binding, they have to sign this contract. They're also asked, in many instances, to abide by the Chinese legal system and potentially, in some of them, even religious practices. I mean, you know, for an Australian academic or someone living in Australia, that really is, I would think, just something that is unacceptable to the average Australian. And the other concern, Peter, isn't it that when you look at some specific examples where Australian academics are working in areas that have a defence application, and then they're also working for Chinese universities that your ASPI, your defence tracker by your analyst Alex Josky, has revealed have several designated defence research areas and defence laboratories. I mean, how problematic is this?
Sharri, I think it's very problematic, and really it's a story that both government and our intelligence community and the universities have been slow to appreciate what's going on. President Xi Jinping of China has very, very firmly brought all of Chinese universities much more directly under the control of the Chinese defence and intelligence establishment, and wants to use those universities and their connection to foreign universities, like in Australia, to boost research and development that is of defence interest to China. And this is something that was, known several years ago, and I think we really should have moved harder and quicker to put some obvious controls in place to prevent individual academics and universities from engaging in connections with China which are really unsafe from a national security perspective. But, regardless of what should have happened, what needs to happen from here on is that we apply that, openness to understand what has been previously agreed to. I think a full-on inquiry is the only thing which can actually get us to the bottom of that. Of course, it's also worth saying, Sharri, that typically when China approaches a university, for example, to set up a Confucius Centre, it's almost always the case that the Chinese side is saying, this must be kept secret. And of course, these things, that's how it works in life under the Communist Party in China. When you're talking about Australian universities, which are supposedly open to free exchange, to independent academic thought, how can these two things work side by side? Our universities have allowed themselves to become too compromised, and I think we're going to have to work back from that now to get to a position where we can have more confidence in what our universities are doing. And the only way to do that is to have more openness about these agreements.
I mean, you say an inquiry is the only or the main option at this point. But, do you think we should be seeing investigations here like the FBI has been doing in the US?
I wouldn't rule out that those are actually happening in some cases, Sharri. I mean, I don't want to imply that our intelligence agencies aren't on the case. They are. But what we're talking about here is a new area, or a relatively new area of concern across a vast number of Australian universities. As I said, some 1,700 agreements. This is going to take a lot of effort on the part of our national security community to get their minds around. In most cases, I guess it will ultimately show that research of certain types is acceptable. But when you talk about things that move into the military realm, into the realm of state security, that's where we have to be concerned. And I think that, our public system will now have to gear in order to be able to deliver something more effective than we have up until right now.
Yeah. Look, Peter, on another topic, I'd love to get your take on the Chinese Deputy Ambassador and his performance at the Press Club in Canberra this week. Let's just have a quick look, a reminder at a few of the things he had to say.
But more importantly, it hurts the feeling of the Chinese people. They use a lot of Chinese idioms and sayings to describe their emotion, but it's difficult to translate. I think it's approximately identical to Julius Caesar in his final day when he saw Brutus approaching him. Et tu, Brute? I don't think we have received any request for a phone call. But as far as I know, I'm the second man in the embassy. I received a phone call from one of your ministers several months ago talking about the trade issue. And if we receive a request, it'll be done in a very diplomatic way.
What were your observations about that speech, Peter?
I'm surprised that the National Press Club would allow an hour of their time to be handed over to listen to what is blatant Chinese propaganda, just Communist Party lines of a type which we all know are frankly false. For example, that ministers are just not calling to get in contact with their Chinese counterparts. We all need to, I think, apply a really healthy dose of scepticism to some of the nonsense that was being peddled at the Press Club. The Australia-China relationship is not like a marriage, nor is it the case that we are entirely at fault for everything that has gone wrong in the relationship. There are serious problems afoot in terms of the direction that China is setting for itself. And these need to be things that the Australian government pushes back against. What the Australian government has been doing has been making decisions that are in the benefit of Australia's national security, as it should. I think the fact that we had, a more considered approach from Minister Wang at the Press Club a few days ago really does not do anything to take away from the reality of China's behaviour, which continues to be about coercion, banning Australian exports, refusing to engage with Australian ministers, cyber spying in industrial depth on Australian government departments and agencies. This is the problem. And fine words from Minister Wang don't really change that ugly reality.
Ultimately, what do you think China's endgame is in antagonising Australia like this through the examples that you just pointed out, whether it's tariffs, whether it's the espionage, whether it's the hacking?
Sharri, I think what China is doing is trying to create a system whereby all of the countries in the region around it are going to adopt a sort of a subservient position to them. China wants not just to be a leading player in the international environment, it wants to be a dominating player in the international environment. And it's going to try to coerce or punish countries that do not support them into being quiet, saying nothing critical, only being praiseworthy of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. That might work in a few countries in Southeast Asia. It is not going to work in Australia. Australians won't tolerate that. And until we can get to a situation where China is prepared for a relationship of equals, where you can accept that there will be differences and not seek to punish the smaller country, I fear we're going to have more of this in a way which is going to make the relationship with China really difficult for months and years ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more ludicrous things he said was that he wouldn't even accept, he said his feelings were hurt, of course, when Australia pushed for there to be a World Health Organization inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. But he wouldn't even accept that basic premise that the virus started in Wuhan. How is anyone meant to accept this as a realistic, genuine statement?
Well, again, it's just propaganda. The Communist Party cannot accept that any fault might lay at its feet for the management of the virus. As I said to someone else, Sharri, that I can tell you this: the virus did not start in Wollongong, right? Until China is prepared to, I think, it just admits to a very basic reality, which was that it emerged out of Wuhan and was appallingly managed by the Communist Party for at least the first couple of months. And until the party can accept that, how can any country expect to have, a serious, trustful conversation with China?
Yeah. Look, just before you go, I just want to ask you about the national security laws the Morrison government announced this week. They were very significant, enormously significant, unprecedented, the ability of the Commonwealth to effectively tear up agreements struck by the states and local councils and other institutions. But there has been some criticism that, these sort of powers won't go into potentially reviewing other deals like the Port of Darwin, which, when we've done interviews before, you've criticised the sale of the Port of Darwin to a Chinese company. Do you think that should be reviewed and should be included under these new laws?
Absolutely, Sharri. It is a loophole. As I understand it, the government says that the legislation will deal with government-to-government relations, but it's not going to look at companies or state-owned entities. Now, in the case of China, what we do know is that state-owned entities in particular are instruments of the Chinese Communist Party, and companies can be told by the Chinese Communist Party under Chinese law at any time to assist them in their intelligence gathering exercises. So there has to be some mechanism. If not this one, then some other mechanism has to be used to look at the operation of Chinese companies and state-owned entities here in Australia. And frankly, if we don't do that, then all China will seek to do is to shift government-to-government agreements to Chinese company-to-government agreements. It's a loophole that will have to be closed if the law is going to work. And I think it's essential that this is done because a lot of what gets agreed is actually agreements that involve Chinese companies and state-owned entities, not just provincial or indeed the Chinese central government.
Yeah. Well, given Anthony Albanese was critical of the fact that it didn't encompass, deals like the Port of Darwin in an interview this morning, perhaps Labor will be moving an amendment. We'll have to wait and see. Peter Jennings, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thanks so much, Sharri. Nice to talk to you.